Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The morning mist clung to the ancient oak grove like a gentle embrace, each droplet holding the first whispers of dawn before releasing them into the warming air. It was here, in this sacred pocket where time moved like honey through amber, that she first unfurled, not born as human children are, with cries and urgency, but emerging from the heart of morning itself, as if the forest had exhaled a dream and it had taken the shape of a child. Ilara lay nestled among the moss-covered roots of the grandmother oak, her tiny form wrapped not in blankets, but in filtered light, as though the grove had woven her from its own accumulated memories and morning prayers. When Lyra found her there, the old weaver's weathered hands recognized immediately that this was no ordinary discovery. The child hummed, a soft wordless melody that seemed to recognize the heartbeat of every living thing within the grove's protective circle, a sound that resonated with the very pulse of the earth beneath them. Lyra, whose 70 years had taught her to listen for the world's quieter truths, knelt beside the sleeping form and felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that arrived without explanation. As she lifted Ilara from her nest of roots and moss, she sensed the gentle vibration of that mysterious hum flowing through her own bones, awakening every sleeping kindness in her heart. The child's eyes, when they opened, held depth that spoke of ancient understanding, as if she had been listening to the world's secrets long before taking her first breath in this realm of bark and birdsong. The walk back to Lyra's cottage became a procession of quiet wonder. Birds followed them with the respectful attention of witnesses to something sacred, and the wildflowers they passed seemed to turn their faces toward Ilara as if she carried within her small form the essence of every sunrise they had ever welcomed. The very air shimmered around the child, and Lyra noticed how her basket felt lighter, not because Ilara weighed nothing, but because she seemed to carry her own gentle gravity, the kind that exists in lullabies and in the way old stones hold afternoon warmth. In the cottage, surrounded by looms and baskets of wool dyed in colors that captured every mood of the forest, Ilara's gift began to reveal itself in the gentlest of ways. She would reach toward objects with a focus that seemed beyond her apparent age, her small fingers hovering just above surfaces as if she could feel invisible stories dancing there. When Lyra placed her near the old rocking chair, where 3 generations of village children had been soothed to sleep, Ilara's hum took on new harmonies, as if she were somehow joining her voice to the lullabies that still lingered. In the worn wooden arms, the first true sign of Ilara's nature came on a rain-soaked afternoon when she was barely old enough to sit upright. Lyra had been mending a torn quilt, one that had belonged to the baker's wife who had passed the previous winter, when she noticed Ilara reaching toward the faded fabric with unusual intensity. As the child's fingers brushed the cotton, her humming grew richer, more complex, and for just a moment, Lyra could have sworn she caught the scent of fresh bread and heard the echo of gentle laughter that had once filled the baker's kitchen on countless mornings. It was then that Lyra understood. This child did not simply see the world as it appeared in the present moment. She perceived the layers of love and sorrow, joy and longing, that clung to places and objects like invisible tapestries woven from the emotions of all who had touched them. Every cup that had held tea during important conversations, every doorway that had witnessed hellos and goodbyes, every pillow that had caught tears or dreams, all of these sang their stories to Ilara in frequencies only she could hear. Rather than fear this gift, Lyra embraced it with the wisdom that comes from understanding that the world holds far more mystery than most dare to acknowledge. She began to speak to Ilara not as one speaks to an infant, but as one speaks to an old friend who has simply forgotten how to use words. The cottage became a sanctuary of understanding, where every evening brought new discoveries about the depth of connection that flows between all living things. As the seasons turned and Ilara grew from infant to toddler, her humming evolved into something that seemed to heal the very spaces around her. A wooden spoon left on the table would hum with the memory of shared meals and quiet laughter. A faded shawl draped over a chair would resonate with the warmth of hands that had knitted it, and the comfort it had offered through long winters. Ilara would often sit, her small head tilted, listening to these silent stories, her eyes wide with a gentle wonder that was never fear. Visitors to the cottage often commented on how peaceful they felt there, how their troubles seemed lighter somehow, though they could never quite explain why. Lyra knew it was because Ilara's presence somehow helped the old sorrows settle into acceptance, and the lingering joys expand into gratitude. The child was learning to navigate a world where every object held memory. Every space contained echoes of the hearts that had passed through it, and every moment was layered with the accumulated love and loss of all who had come before. In the gentle guidance of Lyra's understanding, Ilara was beginning to see this gift not as a burden, but as the most precious form of empathy, the ability to witness and honor every story the world had ever whispered into existence. The cottage, with its filtered sunlight and the rhythmic cadence of Lyra's loom, became her first classroom in the art of listening to the gentle hum of forgotten things, where every thread told a tale, and every silence held a song waiting to be heard. At night, when the lamp burned low and shadows made their own gentle arguments along the ceiling, Lyra would hum back to her, a tune that had never decided whether it was a lullaby or a prayer, and did not need to. Ilara would fall asleep with the shawl over her shoulders, the one that smelled like the first hour of day, and the house would settle around them, listening as houses do. In the dark, she learned another kind of echo, the one that lives behind breathing, the one that belongs to the space between thoughts, telling her that everything that had ever loved was still there, softened by distance, steady as stars behind clouds. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, and with each passing month, Ilara's understanding of the world's quiet language deepened. What had begun as wordless humming in response to the cottage's gentle echoes gradually evolved into something more deliberate, a way of listening that acknowledged every story whispered by the things around her. Lyra watched this unfolding with the patience of someone who understood that the most precious gifts require the gentlest cultivation. She never pushed Ilara to explain what she heard, never demanded demonstrations of her unusual sensitivity. Instead, she created an atmosphere of quiet acceptance, where the child could explore her gift like a flower opening to morning light. Their days developed a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mornings found them in the garden, where Ilara would kneel beside the old rosebush and listen to the layers of care embedded in its roots, decades of gentle hands pruning and watering, voices humming lullabies while tending the soil. She learned to distinguish between different qualities of attention, the bright yellow warmth of someone who gardened with joy, the deeper amber glow of someone who found solace in the earth during times of sorrow. Lyra taught her to approach these echoes with reverence. "Place your palm and wait," she would say softly. "Breathe as if you're not trying to hear anything at all." Ilara discovered that if she reached too quickly, the stories scattered like startled birds. But if she waited, if she softened her intention, they would settle and begin to speak in the ways they knew how. She began to develop names for what she felt, simple words that helped her navigate the emotional landscape without drowning in it. The worn wooden spoon in the kitchen jar carried what she called bread warmth, the golden contentment of countless shared meals. The draft that sometimes whispered under the door held winter lonely, a silvery blue feeling that wasn't sad exactly, but quietly yearning for connection. One afternoon, when Ilara was helping Lyra sort through a basket of mending, she encountered a small child's mitten that made her pause. The wool held such a complex melody of emotions that she had to sit down on the cottage floor, her small hands cradling the tiny garment. "It remembers being lost," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same gentle certainty she used when describing the color of sky. "But it also remembers being found. It's like crying followed by laughter." Lyra knelt beside her, understanding immediately. Mrs. Henley's grandson lost that mitten last winter. She found it weeks later, frozen in the garden, and wept with relief because it was the last thing his mother had knitted before she passed. She touched Ilara's cheek gently. "You're hearing the whole story, the worry and the gratitude together." This became Ilara's way of learning about the world, not through books or formal lessons, but through the emotional archaeology of everyday objects. Each item in the cottage became a teacher. The grandfather clock that had marked time for 4. Generations sang of Christmas mornings and midnight vigils, of children waiting for parents to return from long journeys. A chipped teacup on the kitchen shelf, hummed with the memory of confidences shared over countless cups of chamomile tea, secrets whispered between friends who trusted each other with their deepest fears. As her vocabulary grew, Ilara began to understand that her role was not to change these echoes, but simply to witness them with such complete compassion that they found a kind of peace in being truly heard. When she encountered a corner where old sadness had settled, she would sit quietly and hum back to it, not trying to fix or erase the sorrow, but offering the comfort of recognition, the gentle acknowledgement that every feeling deserved to be seen. The village children, when they encountered Ilara during Lyra's trips to the market, seemed instinctively drawn to her presence. She had a way of listening that made them feel truly heard, as if she understood not just their words, but the feelings that lived beneath the words. Parents began to notice that their children seemed calmer after spending time with the gentle child who lived with the old weaver, though they couldn't quite explain why. Lyra helped her understand these interactions through stories told by lamplight, gentle narratives about how love persists in objects long after the lovers have gone, how comfort can be woven into blankets that will warm strangers' hearts decades later. "Think of it like rings in a tree," Lyra would say, her voice soft as falling leaves. "Each ring tells a story of a year, of sun and rain. These echoes tell stories of hearts, of laughter and tears woven into the very fabric of time." In the quiet sanctuary of the cottage, surrounded by the gentle hum of forgotten things, Ilara was learning the most crucial lesson of her childhood, that her gift was not about fixing the world's sorrows or amplifying its joys, but about bearing witness to the truth that nothing touched by genuine human emotion ever truly disappears. Love once given transforms into something that can nourish future hearts. Grief, when witnessed with sufficient tenderness, eventually softens into gratitude for what was shared. As autumn deepened and the first frost painted the cottage windows, with crystalline patterns, Ilara could walk through her small world with her senses half open, guided by the practice of returning to her breath whenever the chorus of echoes grew too crowded. She was learning the language of forgotten things, discovering that every whisper held wisdom, every echo carried love, and every moment of true listening was a gift to the world's hidden stories. The first snow of winter settled like a whispered blessing over the cottage, and with it came the deeper rhythms that would shape the most precious months of Ilara's childhood. The loom sang its steady song from dawn to dusk, a heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the house itself, and Ilara learned to measure time not by the clock on the mantel, but by the gentle percussion of shuttle and thread, the soft conversations between warp and weft that spoke of patience, made manifest. Lyra taught not with words, but with the quiet demonstration of hands that had spent decades translating care into tangible form. Their mornings began with the ritual of shared tea, 2 chipped cups steaming in the pale light while they sat in the comfortable silence that exists between souls who understand each other completely. Ilara would wrap her small fingers around the warm ceramic, feeling the cup's accumulated memories of countless morning conversations, while Lyra's weathered hands moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had learned that love often speaks loudest in the smallest gestures. When Mrs. Chen arrived one frost-bright morning with her grandmother's wedding dress, hoping it could be mended for her daughter's ceremony, Ilara witnessed the full depth of Lyra's gift. The silk had yellowed with age, and delicate lace had torn along the bodice, but as Lyra spread the gown across her work table, Ilara sensed something far more complex than simple fabric damage. The dress trembled with decades of hope and celebration, with the echo of young hands stitching dreams into every seam, with the weight of expectations passed from mother to daughter like precious heirlooms. Lyra approached the torn lace not as a problem to be solved, but as a story requesting gentle attention. Her needle found its path with the patience of someone who understood that true mending honors both the wound and the healing, creating something stronger than what came before. As she worked, she hummed a tune that Ilara had heard on evenings, when the cottage felt especially tender, a melody that hung somewhere between lullaby and prayer, and the very air seemed to settle around that sound, growing warmer and more forgiving. "Feel here," Lyra murmured, guiding Ilara's fingertips to a section of embroidery where tiny seed pearls caught the lamplight. This was stitched by someone humming, Can you sense the joy woven into these threads? Elara could indeed feel it. A golden warmth that sparkled like sunlight on water. The echo of a young woman singing while she prepared for the most important day of her life. Under Lyra's patient guidance, she learned that mending was not about erasing damage, but about helping broken things remember how to be whole. Their evening walks became sacred journeys through the village, lantern light casting gentle circles. On the cobblestone paths, while Lyra greeted each doorstep and garden gate like old friends who had stood faithful watch through countless seasons, she would pause at Henrik's bakery, not because she needed bread, but because the warmth that spilled from his windows carried the accumulated contentment of decades of shared meals and morning conversations. When Henrik's hands began to shake, too badly to knead the daily loaves, Lyra would quietly step behind the counter, her movements so natural that customers barely noticed the transition, and Elara learned that dignity could be preserved through acts so subtle they felt like grace. At home beside the steady rhythm of the loom, Lyra taught Elara the art of gentle boundaries. On days when every object seemed to sing so loudly that concentration became impossible, when the cottage's accumulated echoes threatened to overwhelm her sensitive awareness, Lyra would demonstrate with a piece of gauze held up to the lamplight. "Not a wall that blocks everything out," she would say, her voice soft as falling leaves, "but something that filters, that lets through only what you need to hear right now." Together they practiced this skill, Elara learning to modulate her gift like adjusting the flame on a lamp, discovering that she could choose which stories to witness fully and which to acknowledge with gentle respect before letting them settle back into silence. The cottage itself seemed to respond to their deepening bond, becoming a sanctuary where visitors found their troubles settling into manageable proportions. People began to seek out Lyra's presence during times of transition, bringing not just torn garments but torn hearts, trusting in her ability to offer the kind of listening that helps old sorrows find their way to peace. Elara watched these interactions with growing understanding, seeing how Lyra's gift lay not in fixing what was broken, but in creating space where healing could unfold naturally, like flowers opening to their own perfect timing. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, their shared work at the loom became a meditation on the interconnectedness of all things. Every thread carried intention, every pattern held meaning, and Elara's sensitivity allowed her to sense which combinations would carry the most comfort to their eventual recipients. When they wove a blanket for a newborn, they chose colors that sang of safety and warmth. For a quilt meant to comfort someone grieving, they selected patterns that spoke of continuity, of the way love persists even after physical presence fades. Sometimes, when the lamplight grew soft and the house settled into its evening quiet, Lyra would lift an object from the shelf and share its story, not tales from books, but the quiet histories that lived in things touched by human hands. A wooden bowl carved by a carpenter for his beloved wife still hummed with devotion 50 years later. A child's toy horse, worn smooth by countless adventures, carried the echo of laughter and the security of being cherished. Through these stories, Elara learned that her gift was part of a larger truth about how love persists in the world, how every act of genuine care leaves traces that can nourish future hearts. On a night when snow tapped gently against the windows and the fire burned low in the grate, Elara felt a soft pull in her chest, faint but persistent, like a breeze that knows a window will open if it asks kindly enough. The feeling seemed to come from beyond the village, from a place that held its breath in patient waiting. She mentioned it to Lyra without naming it fully, only saying, "There's a place that feels like it's listening." Lyra placed a spool of pale green thread in Elara's palm, the color of new leaves that know their time is approaching. "Some places choose their visitors," she said, as naturally as discussing the weather. "When they're ready to be tended, they keep asking. We can answer in small ways until then." And so they began preparing, not with grand plans, but with the quiet rituals that had always sustained them. Sweeping their doorstep with particular care, sharing their morning tea with extra gratitude, humming while they worked as if to teach the day itself a low, steady song of readiness and trust. In the gentle sanctuary of their shared life, Elara was learning that wisdom often wore the face of ordinary kindness, that the most profound truths were discovered not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet consistency of care offered day after day, season after season, with the steady devotion of someone who understands that love is not merely a feeling, but a practice refined through countless small acts of attention and grace. The pull that had whispered to Ilara through the long winter nights grew clearer with spring's first tentative breath, drawing her footsteps beyond the village paths toward something that waited with the patient stillness of a letter, left unopened on a windowsill. Lyra noticed how Ilara paused each morning at their garden gate, her head tilted as if listening to a conversation carried on the warming breeze and without need for explanation. She simply wrapped a thermos of tea and two of her softest rolls in a cloth bundle, tucking them into Ilara's small hands with the gentle understanding that some journeys must be taken when they call. The path wound through awakening meadows where early wildflowers dotted the grass like scattered stars, leading Ilara toward a low stone wall that seemed to embrace something precious just beyond her sight. The wooden gate hung slightly ajar, weathered silver by countless seasons, and as she approached, the air itself seemed to exhale with relief, as if it had been holding its breath for far too long. When she stepped through that threshold, Ilara found herself in a place that existed somewhere between abandonment and sanctuary, where wild growth had transformed neglect into a different kind of beauty. The garden spread before her like a forgotten song that still remembered its melody. Roses climbed and tangled in graceful chaos, their canes reaching toward each other, as if seeking comfort in their shared solitude. Stone pathways disappeared beneath cushions of moss that glowed emerald in the filtered sunlight, while herbs had seeded themselves along the borders, creating rivers of lavender and thyme that released their fragrance with her every step. At the garden's heart stood an old fountain, silent now but still holding the promise of music in its carved basin, surrounded by fruit trees whose branches bore the unmistakable ing, signature of hands that had understood the art of patient. Pruning, Ilara stood perfectly, still and let the garden's stories wash over her like gentle rain. Every corner hummed with the echo of devoted care, not the hurried tending of someone fulfilling duty, but the slow, reverent attention of someone who had found in this place a form of prayer made manifest. She could sense the gardener's presence in the careful spacing of perennials that still emerged each spring in perfect harmony, in the placement of a weathered bench, positioned to catch both morning light and evening shadow, in the way climbing roses had been trained to frame a view of the distant hills. The stories whispered themselves to her as she moved along the overgrown paths. Here, where foxgloves towered in purple spires, she felt the echo of quiet pride and the memory of visitors brought to witness how wildness and cultivation could dance together. Near the back wall, where rosemary grew thick and fragrant, she sensed mornings when gentle hands had gathered herbs, while humming a tune that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The same wordless melody that had lived in Lyra's cottage, the universal song of contentment found in simple, repetitive acts of love. Beneath the eaves of a small potting shed, she discovered a collection of clay pots arranged with such care that she knew immediately they had been someone's treasures, each one chosen not for its perfection, but for the way it fit perfectly in weathered palms. A wooden trowel leaned against the shed wall, its handle worn smooth by decades of use, and when Ilara touched it gently, she felt the echo of someone who had approached each plant not as master, but as collaborator, someone who understood that the most profound gardening happened not through control but through conversation. She began her tending not with tools or grand plans, but with the gift Lyra had taught her to offer most freely, the grace of witnessing without judgment. She found a place on the moss-covered bench and simply sat, letting the garden know it was seen, letting its accumulated stories settle around her like a familiar shawl. The melancholy that hung in the air like morning mist wasn't the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the gentle sorrow of a place that had been waiting patiently to be appreciated again, to have its beauty acknowledged and its history honored. Her first acts were small gestures of respect rather than restoration. She cleared fallen branches not to impose order, but to ease small burdens, traced the lines of an old sundial with her fingertips until she could feel the countless sunny hours it had witnessed, sat among the wild roses, and listened to their thorny whispers of resilience and enduring hope. When she encountered weeds that had grown too bold, she removed them with the same careful attention she might use when untangling knots from silk thread, making space rather than conquering territory. With each quiet act, Ilara felt the garden's emotional landscape shift, like light moving across water. The patient's sorrow softened into something closer to gratitude, while traces of old joy began to brighten, as if the plants themselves felt truly seen for the first time in years. Her presence was not about changing what had been, but about honoring it, allowing the accumulated love to breathe again, to know that its story still mattered. Word of the awakening garden traveled through the village in the way that beautiful secrets always do. Carried not through gossip, but through the subtle changes in people who encountered something that fed their souls. Visitors began to appear, not crowds but individuals drawn by the same mysterious pull that had first called to Ilara, people who needed the particular healing that comes from witnessing love that persists beyond physical presence. They would find her there in the gentle hours of morning or evening, kneeling among the herbs or sitting quietly on the old bench, and they would understand without explanation that this was a place where silence held more wisdom than words. Some brought their own small offerings, cuttings from beloved plants, packets of seeds saved from grandmother's gardens, and Ilara would find the perfect spot for these gifts, weaving them into the garden's living tapestry with the same intuitive grace that guided all her work. As spring deepened toward summer, the garden revealed more of its secrets. Hidden beneath a tangle of mint, she discovered a small stone marker carved with a simple compass rose, its lines worn smooth by weather and time. When she touched it, she felt not direction but orientation, the gardener's way of greeting each morning as if it were a friendly traveler, asking gently, "Where will you take me today?" She placed the marker where the main path met the herb garden, a quiet promise to move through each day with intention, to let the world teach her which small act mattered next. In the gentle rhythm of her days between Lyra's cottage and this secret sanctuary, Ilara was learning that her gift extended beyond witnessing the echoes of the past to participating in the creation of new stories, new layers of love that would someday whisper their own secrets to future listeners. The garden had chosen her not as its savior, but as its collaborator in the ongoing work of transforming devotion into beauty, memory into living sanctuary, solitude into a form of communion that connected all hearts across the mysterious distances of time. On a late afternoon, when clouds drifted like slow ships and the light lay down golden in the furrows of the beds, Ilara felt the familiar pull in her chest shift again, not away from the garden but through it, as if a path was being traced from this tended place to another that had begun to listen, somewhere just beyond the next hill, somewhere already humming softly, waiting to be met with the same steady hands and the same quiet song of recognition and care. The summer that followed brought with it a deepening of Ilara's understanding, as if the garden had taught her not only how to listen to forgotten stories, but how to participate in writing new ones. The gentle pull she felt beyond the hills remained patient but persistent, like a melody humming just below the threshold of hearing, and she began to sense that her gift was meant to flow outward in ever-widening circles, touching lives in ways so gentle they might be mistaken for coincidence by those who didn't know how to recognize the quiet miracles. That happened when someone truly listens to what the world needs. Her days developed a rhythm that moved between the sacred spaces she had come to know, Lyra's cottage, with its steady loom and morning tea, the secret garden where she tended both plants and memories, and increasingly the village itself, where she found herself drawn to places and people who carried the particular kind of silence that comes from hearts holding too much alone. She never announced these visits or explained her presence. Instead, she moved through the community like a gentle breeze, arriving where she was needed with the same natural grace that brings rain to thirsty gardens. Mrs. Henley, the baker's widow, whose grandson's mitten had first taught Ilara about the complexity of loss and finding, had been carrying what Ilara had learned to call silver grief, not the sharp pain of fresh loss, but the duller ache of someone who had forgotten how to imagine tomorrow, holding anything but echoes of yesterday. Without planning or announcement, Ilara began appearing at her kitchen door just as the afternoon light slanted golden through the windows, carrying small offerings from the garden, a sprig of rosemary that still hummed with contentment, a handful of mint that whispered of fresh beginnings. She never stayed long or spoke much, but she had a way of sitting at the kitchen table that invited confidence, of listening that made even the smallest concerns feel worthy of attention. When Mrs. Henley mentioned that she'd been thinking of her late husband's music box but couldn't bear to wind it, Elara simply nodded, and the next day brought a small cutting of sweet alyssum, explaining quietly that it was the kind of flower that released its fragrance most generously in the evening hours, when memories felt both most tender and most precious. Somehow, without direct connection, Mrs. Henley found herself winding the music box that very evening, letting its gentle melody fill the spaces where silence had grown too heavy. The ripples of these small interventions spread in ways that surprised even Elara. Mrs. Henley, feeling lighter after weeks of quiet companionship, began humming while she worked in her own small garden. Her neighbor heard that humming through his open window and remembered how his own wife used to sing while hanging laundry. And for the first time since her passing, he found himself hanging his shirts on the line instead of draping them over chairs, letting the summer breeze carry away some of the stuffiness that grief had settled into his daily routines. At the village school, Elara discovered that young Timothy Chen had been carrying his grandmother's worry stone in his pocket every day since she moved to the city, rubbing it smooth with his anxious fingers during lessons and recess. The stone held layers of comfort and concern, decades of prayers whispered into its smooth surface, and Elara could sense how it had become both anchor and burden for the boy who missed his grandmother's presence, but felt responsible for carrying her worries. She began appearing at the school fence during afternoon recess, not to speak with Timothy directly, but to be present in a way that reminded him he wasn't alone in understanding that objects could hold love across great distances. One afternoon, she brought a small river stone from the garden path, one that had been worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and sun, and left it on the fence post where Timothy would find it. This stone carried no history of worry, only the patient strength of something that had learned to let troubles wash over it without being worn away by them. The next day she noticed Timothy had both stones in his pocket, and gradually the tight lines around his young eyes began to soften as he learned that he could honor his grandmother's gift without carrying the weight of her concerns. These small acts accumulated like snowflakes, each one insignificant alone, but together creating a subtle shift in the village's emotional climate. People began sleeping a little better, laughing a little more freely, reaching out to neighbors with offers of help that seemed to arise spontaneously. The grocer started leaving slightly bruised fruit in a basket by his door, with a sign reading, "Free to good homes," discovering that the small gesture brought more joy than any profitable sale. The librarian began staying a few minutes past closing time for patrons who seemed reluctant to leave the quiet sanctuary of books, understanding that some people needed a gentle transition between the solitude of reading and the demands of daily life. Elara moved through these expanding circles of influence like a stone dropped into still water, her presence creating ripples that touched shores she would never see. As Lyra had taught her during those long winter evenings, "You are a conduit, little one, not a controller. The most beautiful mending happens when you trust the threads to find their own way, gently guided by your intention." She was learning that her gift was not about grand gestures or dramatic healings, but about the profound power of witnessing others with such complete acceptance that they remembered their own capacity for joy, their own worthiness of love, their own ability to offer comfort to the world around them. As summer deepened and the garden reached its full glory, blooming with the accumulated care of both its original gardener and Elara's gentle tending, she began to sense that her preparation was nearly complete. The pool beyond the hills had grown clearer, more defined, calling to her with the voice of someone who understood that the most important journeys begin not with dramatic departures, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have learned to listen, to witness, and to offer your presence as a gift to whatever waits ahead. The pull that had whispered to Elara through countless seasons finally took the shape of footsteps on the garden path, arriving not with fanfare, but with the gentle inevitability of morning mist settling into visible form. She was kneeling among the late summer herbs when she felt the familiar stirring in her chest shift and settle, like a question finally meeting its answer. And when she looked up from the chamomile flowers, he was there, standing at the garden gate as if he had been walking toward this moment for years. Kale moved through the world with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that the most important journeys happen at the pace of growing things. And when their eyes met across the herb garden, Ilara felt a recognition that bypassed all need for explanation. His hair held threads of early silver that caught the afternoon light, and his clothes were worn soft by countless miles and weather, carrying in their faded fabric the stories of roads that led not to destinations, but to deeper ways of seeing. The leather satchel across his shoulder seemed to hold more memories than belongings, and when he smiled, it was with the quiet contentment of someone who had learned to find home in the act of searching. "You must be the one who listens to forgotten things," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority as wind through leaves. And somehow Ilara knew this was not a question, but a statement of profound relief. As if he had been following invisible pathways for longer than he cared to count, guided by nothing more substantial than the hope that somewhere, someone was learning to hear what the world had been trying to whisper all along. He introduced himself simply, without ceremony or explanation of how he had found this particular garden, in this particular village, and as they walked the moss-covered paths together, Ilara discovered that Kale possessed a gift that complemented her own in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable. Where she could perceive the emotional echoes held in places and objects, he could sense the invisible threads that connected all hearts touched by genuine care, the pathways that love carves through the world as it moves from one sanctuary to another. From his satchel, he drew a piece of linen that appeared at first glance to be entirely blank. But when he spread it on the stone bench beside the old sundial, letting the afternoon light play across its woven surface, faint lines began to emerge, not drawn with ink but woven into the very fabric, visible only when shadows and brightness found their perfect balance. "It's not a map of where," he explained gently, tracing a finger along a thread-thin curve that seemed to pulse with its own quiet light, but a map of how the routes that open when someone approaches with nothing to fix, only the willingness to witness what asks to be seen. The lines on the linen told a story that Ilara could read without words, showing pathways that connected her secret garden to other places where love had transformed abandonment into beauty, where small acts of witnessing had created ripples of healing that spread far beyond their origins. She could see the thread that led from Lyra's cottage, with its steady loom and morning tea rituals, to a monastery where monks had spent centuries learning to weave compassion into their daily prayers, to a series of homes where extraordinary kindness had bloomed in the most ordinary circumstances. "I've been following these pathways for 15 years, Kale said, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of someone who had found his true work, learning how love persists and transforms across time and distance. Every place that has been truly tended becomes part of this network, sending out signals that call to others who are ready to listen." He paused, watching a butterfly settle on the lavender beside them. "But I've never encountered someone who could hear the stories themselves, who could listen to what the world has been trying to tell us all along." Under his gentle guidance, Ilara began to understand that her gift was not a burden to be carried alone, but part of an ancient conversation between all souls who had learned to love beyond themselves. Kyle taught not through instruction, but through companionship, showing her how to sense the places that were ready to be witnessed, the hearts that were prepared to be heard, the stories that were waiting for someone who could listen with sufficient tenderness to help them find their way to peace. They practiced together in the quiet hours of evening, walking to the edge of the village, where an old stone bridge crossed the slow-moving river. The bridge held layers of story, decades of footsteps carrying people toward reunions and farewells, proposals whispered over moving water, children dropping pebbles and making wishes that scattered like silver coins in the current below. Standing there with Kyle, Ilara learned to perceive not just the individual echoes, but the way they wove together, creating a tapestry of human connection that stretched across generations. "The art," Kyle said softly, as fireflies began their gentle dance above the water. "There's learning to trust the pull, to follow where love leads without needing to understand the destination. The world is always calling to those who can hear, but it never demands more than we're ready to give." As they walked back through the village streets, past windows glowing with lamplight, and the comfortable sounds of families settling into evening routines, Ilara felt her understanding expand like ripples on still water. The small acts of witnessing she had been drawn to, the music box that needed winding, the worry stone that required a companion, the bruised fruit that found its way to grateful hands, were all part of this larger network. Threads in a vast web of compassion that connected every corner of the world, where someone had learned to transform their own healing into a gift for others. That night, as they shared Lyra's chamomile tea by lamplight in the cottage, the three of them formed a circle that felt both complete and beginning, as if they were the first notes of a song that would continue long after the last cup was empty and the final story had been told. The linen map lay folded on the table between them, its hidden pathways waiting to be revealed again when morning light found the right angle. And Ilara understood that her real journey was about to begin, guided not by destinations, marked on paper, but by the invisible geography of hearts that had learned to recognize each other across any distance. In the gentle quiet that settled over them like a blessing, she knew that the wanderer had found her not to take her away from home, but to help her discover that home was not a place, but a quality of attention, not a destination, but a way of moving through the world with eyes and heart wide open, ready to witness whatever asked to be seen, to listen to whatever whispered for understanding, to offer her presence as a gift to the endless conversation between all things touched by love. The morning light found them at the garden bench again, the linen map spread between cups of warm tea and the soft crumble of yesterday's bread. Kale tilted the cloth until the faint threads of possibility revealed themselves, and Ilara watched how the lines shifted when the sunlight changed, not because the pathways moved, but because their willingness to see deepened with each shared moment. He taught her to approach each place like an archaeologist of feeling might approach an ancient site, without hurry, with reverence, with tools made of breath and patience rather than metal and stone. "We don't dig through these layers," he said gently, his voice carrying the same unhurried wisdom as morning mist settling into visible form. "We dust away what obscures. We uncover what asks to be seen. We give names to what we find so we can hold it without being overwhelmed." His words helped Ilara understand that her gift was evolving, from simple listening into something far more intricate, the ability to read the world like a palimpsest, where each layer of human experience had left its trace upon the places and objects that witnessed our deepest moments. Their first expedition together took them to the old stone church at the village's heart, a building that had stood for 3 centuries and held within its walls the compressed prayers and sorrows of countless generations. As they approached the heavy wooden doors, Ilara felt the familiar stirring in her chest intensify, but this time it carried a complexity that made her pause on the threshold, overwhelmed by the sheer density of stories that whispered from every weathered stone, every worn pew, every stained glass window that had witnessed the full spectrum of human devotion and doubt. Kyle placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch carrying the same grounding presence as Lyra's morning tea rituals. "Breathe as if you're learning to move through water," he said softly, not trying to surface quickly but discovering how to navigate depth without drowning. "The stories are layered like rings in an ancient tree. You can choose which level to explore without having to experience them all at once." Inside the sanctuary, the air itself seemed thick with accumulated emotion, and Ilara learned to navigate these depths with the same careful attention she had once brought to untangling silk threads. The newest layer held the bright anxiety of recent weddings and baptisms, the silver grief of funerals that still felt raw to those who mourned. Beneath this, she found decades of Sunday morning contentment, the golden warmth of communities gathering to share their hopes and fears in the safety of ritual and song. But as she followed Kale's guidance deeper, she discovered layers that stretched back through generations, the desperate prayers whispered during wartime, the quiet gratitude of harvest celebrations, the profound silence that had settled over the sanctuary during years when faith itself required more courage than most hearts could summon. At the altar, where centuries of couples had pledged their lives to each other, Ilara discovered what Kale called love archaeology, the way promises made in hope accumulated like layers of pearl, each vow strengthening those that came before and after. Some promises had been kept through decades of quiet devotion. Others had been broken and mended and broken again, but all of them contributed to the altar's deep understanding of what it meant to risk one's heart in service of something greater than solitary existence. They practiced this deeper form of listening in other sacred spaces throughout the village. At Mrs. Barlow's house, where an attic held trunks of letters and memories, Ilara learned to rest her awareness on surfaces without invasive curiosity, allowing the accumulated love and longing to rise like morning mist. The practice wasn't about reading private thoughts, but about witnessing the emotional essence that lingered. A woman writing by lamplight to a sister across the sea. Lullabies hummed at midnight. Decisions postponed until harvest time. When they suggested that Mrs. Barlow simply sit with these memories over a cup of tea, treating the attic like a place to visit an old friend, the woman discovered a peace she hadn't known she was seeking. At the village school, the lost and found box became another archaeological site, where Elara could practice reading the layers of childhood emotion embedded in forgotten objects. A tiny shoe held the fizzing yellow adoration of toddler laughter that made sleepless nights worthwhile. A scarf carried the shy heat of a first performance on stage. A teacher's cardigan held the quiet fatigue of someone who always stayed late and never mentioned it. And when Elara mended a loose cuff, not to fix the sweater but to anchor the feeling of being held, she left the repair visible like a story told on purpose. Under Kyle's patient guidance, Elara began to develop her own vocabulary for these discoveries, creating names that helped her navigate the emotional landscape without losing herself in its depths. She called the warm contentment found in well-used kitchens bread light, the bittersweet ache of outgrown children's rooms threshold silver, and the deep peace that settled in places where genuine forgiveness had occurred dove gray, grace. These names became tools that allowed her to witness profound feelings without being overwhelmed by their intensity. As autumn painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Elara's ability to read these emotional archaeological sites expanded to encompass the entire village. She could sense how the old mill held the steady contentment of work that served essential needs, how the cemetery carried not just grief, but the profound peace that comes when sorrow is witnessed by an entire community. The practice required a delicate balance between openness and protection, between deep listening and healthy boundaries, and Kale taught her to recognize the difference between stories that wanted to be heard and those that needed to rest undisturbed. The archaeological layers of emotion that surrounded her no longer felt overwhelming but supportive, like being held by the accumulated love of everyone who had ever learned to transform their own healing into a gift for future generations. She was becoming part of the story herself, adding her own layer to the great sediment of human experience, contributing her voice to the eternal conversation between all souls who had discovered that the most profound healing happens not in isolation but in the recognition that every heart's journey toward wholeness somehow serves the healing of the world itself. In the gentle quiet of evening, as they walked back through the village streets past windows glowing with lamplight, Elara felt a new pull beginning to clarify, not urgent but persistent. Like a melody humming just below the threshold of hearing, it seemed to emanate from the direction of the library, where books waited like patient repositories of countless hearts' journeys, and where someone tended them with the same devotion she had learned to bring to her own sacred work of witnessing the world's forgotten stories. The pull toward the library had been growing clearer with each passing evening, drawing Elara's footsteps along the cobblestone path, where lamplight spilled golden through tall windows long after the village had settled into sleep. The building seemed to exhale patience itself, holding within its stone walls the accumulated breath of countless readers who had found refuge in these quiet spaces. And as she approached the heavy oak doors on a crisp October evening, she felt the familiar stirring that came when she encountered a place ready to share its deepest stories. Inside, the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue carried deeper notes now, the emotional residue of discoveries made and solace found among the careful arrangements of human knowledge and imagination. Using the archaeological skills Kyle had taught her, Elara let her awareness settle gently on surfaces without invasion, discovering that each section held its own emotional layers. The children's corner glowed with bright traces of wonder and the security that comes from being read to by someone who understands that stories are essential nourishment for growing souls. The poetry section hummed with the silver intensity of hearts, trying to capture in words what could only be felt, while the history shelves carried the weight of civilizations, learning to remember both their triumphs and failures with equal honesty. At the library's heart, she found someone moving between the stacks, with the same reverent attention she brought to her work in the garden, treating each book not just as an object but as a repository of someone's attempt to transform understanding into a gift for future hearts. Rowan emerged from between the shelves with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to move through the world, as if every step were part of a larger conversation with silence itself. His eyes holding the same deep attention Ilara had learned to recognize in others who understood that the most important things are often invisible to hurried glances. "I wondered when you would find your way here," he said, his voice soft as turning pages, and their introduction happened not through words, but through the shared recognition that passes between souls who have been shaped by similar forms of listening. When Rowan's fingers traced the spine of a particularly worn volume, Ilara could sense the same quality of care that she herself brought to mending torn fabric or tending forgotten roses, and she understood immediately that he possessed his own form of emotional archaeology. "Books are like people," Rowan said, settling into a worn leather chair and gesturing for Ilara to take the small stool nearby. "They carry more than their obvious contents." This collection of letters between poets still holds the longing that brought these words into existence. And this children's picture book remembers every bedtime story, every moment when someone used these simple words to help a small heart feel safe in the darkness. As they talked through the gentle hours of evening, Ilara discovered that where she could perceive the stories held in places and objects, Rowan had developed the ability to sense which books would speak most directly to the particular sorrows and joys that visitors carried with them. Their conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of streams, finding their way to the same river, each sharing discoveries about how love persists in things touched by human hands, how stories accumulate layers of meaning as they pass from heart to heart across generations. When Rowan showed her a collection of donated family documents, photo albums and journals, birth certificates and wedding announcements, Ilara felt the familiar stirring that came when she encountered stories asking to be witnessed. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by something new, a sense of completion, as if her gift had been waiting to find this particular form of collaboration. Together they began creating what Rowan called memory maps, careful arrangements that allowed the emotional essence of these documents to be appreciated without invasion of privacy. Working by lamplight, they discovered how their gifts complemented each other perfectly. A wedding photo might be paired with a pressed flower from the bride's garden that Ilara could sense still carried joy, creating a small shrine to love that had been witnessed by an entire community. A child's report card could be arranged alongside a teacher's letter, showing how encouragement offered in one generation could echo through decades of growth and achievement. Their bond deepened through the unobtrusive care of ordinary evenings. Ilara would bring fresh sprigs of lavender from the garden to tuck into returned volumes, while Rowan saved the first glance of newly donated photo albums for her, understanding that she could recognize which families the pictures still belonged to, even when names had faded. Sometimes they read without speaking, taking turns to circle a meaningful line, each glance across the table an acknowledgement of shared understanding. As dawn approached and first light began filtering through the tall windows, Ilara understood that she had found not just a kindred spirit, but a collaborator in the work of helping the world's forgotten stories find their way to peace. In Rowan's presence, her gift expanded beyond individual listening to encompass something larger, the creation of spaces where memory could be honored, where love could be recognized across time, where the accumulated wisdom of human hearts could be preserved and shared with future generations. Walking home through the village as the sun painted the cobblestones gold, Ilara felt her heart expanding to encompass this new dimension of her calling, sensing already how the library would become another sacred space in the growing network of places where healing happened quietly, where stories found the witnesses they deserved, where the gentle art of truly seeing transformed ordinary moments into sanctuaries of grace that would nurture hearts for generations yet to come. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing, with Ilara and Rowan discovering that their deepest conversations happened not through words, but through the symphony of shared silences that flowed between them like a gentle river finding its perfect course. Their evenings developed rituals that honored both solitude and connection, each finding in the other's presence a quality of attention that made their individual gifts more luminous. like instruments learning to harmonize without losing their distinct voices. In the library's gentle lamplight, they learned to distinguish between different qualities of quiet. There was the morning silence, soft as settling mist, when Rowan would unlock the heavy doors and light would unfold across the worn wooden floors. The midday silence held a different texture, golden and patient, when visitors moved between the stacks with the reverent attention of pilgrims approaching sacred ground. And the evening silence carried the deepest music of all, lavender blue and thoughtful. When their work was donated, memories transformed the reading room into a sanctuary where forgotten stories could finally rest in the arms of understanding. Witnesses, their collaboration on the memory maps deepened into something that felt like prayer made manifest. Working by lamplight, they would arrange photographs and letters, pressed flowers and faded documents, creating small altars that honored the persistence of love across generations. When they encountered a box of correspondence between siblings, separated by an ocean, and 40 years of misunderstanding, their gifts wove together seamlessly, Ilara sensing the accumulated longing that clung to each envelope like invisible tears, while Rowan understood instinctively how these letters could be arranged to tell the story of love that refuses to surrender despite distance and silence. They invented small rituals without announcing them, gestures that spoke in the language of care made visible. Rowan would prepare tea in 2 mismatched cups that had found their way to the library through various donations, each one carrying its own story of comfort, offered in kitchens where important conversations had unfolded over countless shared meals. Ilara would arrange whatever she had gathered from the garden that day, late roses that still hummed with summer's contentment, sprigs of rosemary that whispered of continuity and remembrance, creating offerings that honored the stories they encountered together. Their courtship unfolded in the spaces between these shared discoveries, in moments when their hands would brush while arranging photographs, when their eyes would meet across a particularly moving passage they had found in someone's journal, when the comfortable silence between them would deepen into something that felt like recognition of souls who had been searching for each other across lifetimes. Neither rushed toward declarations or demanded definitions of what was growing between them. Instead, they let their bond develop with the same patient attention they brought to their work. On a night when the first snow began falling beyond the library windows, creating a hushed sanctuary that felt removed from ordinary time, a traveling musician appeared at their door. His violin case scuffed and his voice frayed with too many nights on too few coins. Without words, Rowan gestured toward the chair by the hearth, while Ilara brewed tea with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that hospitality was simply love made practical. When the musician finally lifted his instrument, the first note was thin, almost apologetic, but the room made space for it, and by the third note the sound had found its body, a tone that carried wood smoke and early snow, and the particular loneliness that comes from carrying beauty through an indifferent world. No one applauded when he finished. They offered something better. They held still long enough for the last vibration to sink into the wood of the tables, into the pages of open books, into the musician himself. He slept there that night, and in the morning he left a melody behind that seemed to echo in the stairwell for days, an invisible thank you that transformed the library's very atmosphere. Their first kiss happened not as dramatic culmination, but as natural deepening of understanding, soft as snow settling on windowsills, gentle as the way beloved books opened to reveal their most treasured passages. Surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of countless hearts who had learned to transform their experiences into gifts for future generations, they became part of the story themselves, adding their own layer to the great archive of love that the library held within its patient walls. Walking home together through snow-hushed village streets, their footsteps creating the first tracks on cobblestones, Ilara felt her gift expanding again, not just to encompass individual stories, but to recognize that she and Rowan were becoming part of something larger, a living example of how hearts that learn to truly see each other create ripples of healing that spread far beyond their immediate circle. People began seeking out the library not only for books, but for the particular quality of peace that had settled over the reading rooms, the way their shoulders dropped when they crossed the threshold. Without planning or announcement, an hour before closing became what everyone quietly called the listening hour, a time when visitors could sit wherever they wished, sometimes sharing a meaningful passage aloud, sometimes simply resting in the profound quiet that held space for whatever needed to be witnessed. In the gentle sanctuary of their shared understanding, surrounded by stories that had found their perfect witnesses, Clara and Rowan discovered that love was not separate from their individual callings, but the completion of them, creating together a space where the world's forgotten songs could finally find voices worthy of their beauty, where every silence held the promise of recognition, and where two hearts learning to listen had become the first notes of a much larger symphony that would soon invite the entire community to add their own voices to its expanding, ever-deepening song. The symphony that had begun with two hearts learning to recognize each other soon expanded to encompass the entire village, as if their quiet understanding had created a tuning fork that helped others discover harmonies they hadn't known they were capable of singing. The listening hour at the library became a gentle magnet that drew people not through announcement or invitation, but through the mysterious pull that always guides hearts toward places where they might be truly heard. And what began as an evening refuge soon transformed into something far more precious, a community learning to tend its own collective memory. Mrs. Henley was among the first to understand what was happening, arriving one crisp October evening with a wicker basket containing her late husband's sheet music and the small wooden metronome that had kept time for 40 years of piano lessons in their front parlor. She didn't ask for anything specific, simply placed these treasures on the reading table and sat quietly while Elara's awareness settled gently on surfaces that hummed with decades of patient instruction and the particular joy that comes from watching children discover they can create beauty with their own hands. When Rowan suggested they create a small display honoring the village's musical heritage, Mrs. Henley's eyes brightened, with the recognition that her husband's gift to countless young musicians could continue echoing through future generations. The baker's son arrived the following week with his grandfather's collection of handwritten recipes, each card stained with flour and spotted with ingredients that had fed 3 generations of neighbors during celebrations and sorrows alike. These weren't just formulas for bread and pastries, but maps of community care, detailed instructions for transforming simple ingredients into the kind of nourishment that helps hearts remember they belong somewhere. Working together by lamplight, they created a corner where these recipes lived alongside stories of the meals they had made possible. Wedding cakes that had sweetened new beginnings, funeral casseroles that had carried comfort to grieving families, loaves shared with new mothers when words felt inadequate, but warm bread spoke perfectly. As autumn deepened and the first frost painted delicate patterns on the library windows, Elara began to recognize her role, evolving from solitary listener to something more complex, a weaver of collective understanding who could help the village see itself as a living story where every heart's journey contributed to the whole. The old school teacher brought boxes of children's artwork saved from decades of classrooms, drawings that captured the village through young eyes across generations of growth and change. Timothy Chen, now confident in carrying both his grandmother's worry stone and the river stone Elara had given him, contributed photographs from the Great Flood 20 years ago. Images that showed neighbors helping neighbors with the matter-of-fact grace that emerges when individual survival depends on collective care. Each new addition to their growing archive created ripples of recognition and connection that spread through the village like gentle rain soaking into thirsty earth. The grocer began offering cooking demonstrations on Saturday afternoons, teaching young families the traditional preparations their grandmothers had known by heart. The librarian from the neighboring village heard about their memory maps and brought similar donations, creating links between communities that had always shared more than they had realized. During the long evenings of early winter, when snow tapped softly against the windows and the library's warmth drew visitors seeking refuge from the cold, someone suggested creating a community quilt, a growing tapestry where anyone could add a square. The project took root in the reading room, pinned to corkboards where neighbors could contribute pieces of fabric that carried their own stories. There was a square cut from a wedding dress that still shimmered with joy, another pieced from flour sacks that smelled faintly of sugar, and Henrik's morning bread, a child's contribution that glittered with mica like starlight, scattered on dark water. Elara's gift expanded to encompass what she began to think of as community, archaeology, the ability to perceive how individual stories wove together to create the larger narrative of a place where people had learned to care for each other across generations. When young mothers brought their babies to the listening hour, she would hum the same wordless melody that had first emerged in the oak grove, and the infants would settle into peaceful sleep while their parents found the rest that comes from being truly witnessed in their exhaustion and wonder. Kyle appeared and disappeared with the seasons, each return bringing new threads on his linen map, pathways that pulsed outward from their village toward other places where similar sanctuaries were awakening. He taught Ilara to notice the delicate pull that meant a new connection had been made somewhere in the world, another community learning to tend its own stories with the reverence they deserved. Spring arrived with its own gifts of recognition and renewal, and during the Easter celebration, when the entire village gathered in the square for the traditional sharing of bread and honey, Ilara stood surrounded by faces she had learned to read like beloved books. The moment felt like completion and beginning simultaneously, as if they had all been walking toward this recognition that community was not just a collection of individual lives but a living organism capable of its own forms of memory and healing. In the gentle bustle of neighbors sharing food and laughter, children playing games passed down through countless springs, Ilara felt the familiar stirring in her chest shift again, not pulling her away, but deepening her understanding of what it meant to be rooted in a place that had learned to tend its own stories, where every heart's journey toward wholeness somehow served the healing of the world itself, where the gentle hum of forgotten things had become a song the entire community knew how to sing. The year turned as gently as pages in a well-loved book, and Ilara began to understand that memory itself moved through seasons the way her garden did, each feeling ripening in its own time before transforming into something new and nourishing. The community quilt that had grown throughout the summer now stretched across 3 tables in the library's reading room, its accumulated squares telling stories of resilience and connection that seemed to shimmer with their own quiet light when afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows. The first profound lesson in memory's seasons came with the passing of old Henrik, the baker, whose hands had shaped countless loaves and whose kitchen had been a gathering place for 3 generations of neighbors. When his family began the gentle work of clearing his shop, they discovered notebooks filled with careful observations about the village, not gossip or judgment, but the loving notations of someone who had learned to read the community's emotional weather through the patterns of who bought extra bread during difficult times, who lingered at the counter needing conversation, who quietly paid for their neighbors' loaves without mention. Sitting with these notebooks in the library's lamplight, Ilara felt the familiar stirring that came when stories asked to be witnessed. But this time the sensation carried new depth, the recognition that Henrik's death had not ended his contribution, but transformed it, like autumn leaves returning to nourish the soil where new growth would emerge. Working with Rowan and the baker's daughter, they created a memorial that honored not just Henrik's life, but his way of seeing, displaying his observations alongside photographs that showed the countless small acts of generosity he had facilitated through his understanding of who needed what. When, as autumn deepened and the first frost painted delicate patterns on cottage windows, Ilara watched how grief moved through the village like a gentle river finding its course. Mrs. Henley, who had once held sorrow like a stone in her chest, found herself telling a child how her husband used to hum while kneading dough, and halfway through the memory she laughed, surprised to discover that joy had returned to live alongside her remembrance. The silver grief that had once felt so heavy had softened into something closer to gratitude, not because the loss mattered less, but because the love it represented had grown stronger than the absence. Winter arrived like a protective hush, giving everything permission to rest and reflect. The garden slept beneath its clean white blanket, while the library became a sanctuary where people moved more slowly, lingered longer over cups of tea that steamed against frost-etched windows. During these quiet months, Lyra began showing the gentle signs of age that arrive like morning mist, subtle at first, then gradually transforming the landscape of daily life. Her hands, which had guided thread and needle with such sure grace for 7 decades, began to tremble slightly, and the complex patterns that had once flowed from her loom like music gave way to simpler designs that honored what her fingers could still accomplish with dignity. Rather than grief, this transition brought unexpected gifts, Lyra began teaching not through demonstration, but through story, sharing the emotional archaeology of every quilt and tapestry she had created over the years. Each piece held its own history. The wedding blanket woven during a harsh winter, when love had to be strong enough to carry two hearts through scarcity. The christening gown that had been passed through 5 families, because its particular shade of cream seemed to bless every child who wore it. Hilara learned to read these textile stories with the same archaeological attention she brought to other forms of memory, understanding that each thread choice had been made not just for beauty but for the emotional qualities different materials could carry. Spring arrived like a gentle remembering, and with it came reconciliations that sprouted where no one had expected them. The long-estranged brothers who had written to each other through the library's quiet mediation met on the stone bridge and stood watching the river until apologies arrived of their own accord. Hilara observed how even the most painful echoes, when witnessed with sufficient tenderness, could become sources of wisdom and compassion. The old mill, which had held dark resonance for years after a tragic accident, began to hum with a different quality as the community gathered there occasionally for quiet reflection, transforming a place of sorrow into a testament to collective resilience. By summer, the village had learned to tend its own stories with the same natural grace that brought rain to thirsty gardens. The listening hour at the library had evolved into something that happened spontaneously throughout the week, wherever neighbors gathered. Children began interviewing their grandparents, creating an oral history that captured not just facts, but the emotional texture of how love had persisted through decades of change. The post office became a place where people lingered to share news that mattered more than mail delivery, while the village square hosted impromptu storytelling sessions when elderly residents felt moved to share memories of how the community had weathered previous challenges. During the harvest festival that autumn, as golden light slanted through the square and the scent of apple cider mingled with wood smoke and laughter, Hilara stood beside Rowan watching children play the same games their great-grandparents had enjoyed. She understood that she was witnessing the completion of a cycle that had begun in the oak grove where she first awakened. The village had become a living organism capable of its own forms of memory and healing, where every individual story contributed to collective wisdom that would nurture future generations. In the gentle bustle of neighbors sharing the fruits of their gardens and the products of their crafts, Hilara felt her role shifting from active intervention to something more like stewardship. The familiar stirring in her chest no longer pulled her toward new discoveries, but settled deeper into recognition that some gifts are meant to take root, to become part of the soil where future forms of beauty can grow, to join the eternal conversation between all hearts that have learned to transform their own healing into nourishment for the world. As the first fog of the season rolled in from the eastern hills, threading the streets with cool silk, Hilara sensed new stories approaching on the gentle wind, whispers of distant shores and faithful lights that turned in slow circles, calling to hearts ready for the next chapter of their journey toward understanding that love, once planted, blooms eternal in forms too, beautiful and varied to ever fully comprehend. The fog that had whispered of distant shores through the autumn harvest festival finally took the shape of small footsteps on the village path, arriving not with urgency, but with the patient inevitability of morning light finding its way through mist. Clara appeared at the library's stone steps on a day when the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. A child of perhaps 8 years, whose eyes held depths that spoke of horizons measured not in miles, but in the gentle turning of lighthouse beams across restless waters. She sat quietly on the worn steps, her dark hair touched with salt spray, and her small hands cradling a piece of sea glass that had been worn smooth by countless tides. When Hilara approached, drawn by the familiar stirring that came when she encountered someone carrying stories that needed gentle witnessing, Clara looked up with the composed attention of someone who had been listening to the world's deeper conversations for much longer than her apparent age would suggest. In that moment of recognition, Hilara felt the same resonance that had once passed between herself and Lyra, the acknowledgement that arrives when one gift encounters another, like musical instruments discovering they were always meant to harmonize. "I've been walking toward the place where forgotten things remember how to sing," Clara said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had spent long hours in the company of waves and wind. And Hilara understood immediately that this child had traveled far more than the distance between one village and another. Without need for explanation or adult consultation, she extended her hand to the small traveler who had somehow found her. Way to the sanctuary that patient love and careful listening had created in this corner of the world. Clara's story emerged through the gradual sharing that happens when trust builds like morning light slowly illuminating a familiar room. Her father had been the keeper of a lighthouse on a rocky point where shipping lanes converged, and she had grown up in the steady rhythm of the great beam turning through its eternal circle. Her gift manifested as an ability to perceive what she called heart distances, not physical space, but the emotional currents that moved beneath the surface of all journeys, whether measured in miles or in the space between one soul's understanding and another's recognition. She could sense when ships passed carrying what she named homesick light, or when travelers approached the lighthouse bearing the silver weight of difficult farewells. Around people, she saw faint patterns that pulsed like gentle stars, threads of connection that revealed not their past stories, but their potential for healing, for joy, for the kind of recognition that helps lost souls remember they belong somewhere. When her father had been called to tend a more distant lighthouse, Clara had been left with relatives who loved her, but couldn't understand why she would spend hours at windows, counting in soft rhythms that seemed to calm both herself and anyone who heard them. In the gentle sanctuary of the library, surrounded by books that held the accumulated wisdom of countless journeys, Clara found what she had been seeking without knowing how to name it. Ilara recognized in the child's gift a reflection of her own journey toward understanding. And she became Clara's mentor not through formal instruction, but through the same patient companionship that Lyra had once offered to a small girl found sleeping among oak roots. Together, they practiced the art of gentle boundaries that Lyra had taught through the metaphor of gauze held to lamplight. Not a wall that blocks everything out, Ilara would say softly. Watching Clara learn to modulate her sensitivity, like adjusting the flame on a lamp, but something that filters, that lets through only what you need to witness right now. Clara's counting ritual, which had once seemed like a solitary habit, revealed itself as a sophisticated technique for managing the overwhelming abundance of emotional information that surrounded her. Different rhythms for different kinds of recognition, each pattern helping her offer the most helpful form of witnessing. The village, which had learned to recognize Ilara's gentle touch over the years, now embraced Clara's quiet illumination. People didn't understand exactly what the child saw when she tilted her head and counted in soft whispers, but they felt the subtle shifts her presence inspired, the gentle nudges toward hope, the recognition of possibilities they hadn't noticed, the comfort that comes from being seen by someone who understands that every heart carries its own form of light. Working with Rowan in the library's memory archives, Clara began creating what they called journey maps, careful arrangements of donated travel journals, postcards from distant places, and photographs that captured the emotional essence of exploration and discovery. Her unique vision helped visitors understand that every journey, whether across oceans or simply from one season of life to another, contributed to the great archive of human courage and curiosity that connected all hearts willing to venture beyond the familiar. As winter settled over the village like a protective embrace, Clara's presence seemed to complete a circle that had been slowly forming through all the seasons of Ilara's growth. In teaching the child, Ilara discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from passing on not just knowledge, but the capacity for deep witnessing, the art of gentle guidance, the quiet wisdom that helps others find their own light within the vast network of connection that binds all hearts touched by genuine love, in the gentle rhythm of days that moved between lighthouse bright clarity and the soft focus of fog-wrapped mornings, surrounded by the accumulated stories of a community that had learned to tend its own memories. Ilara understood that her gift was meant to flow forward as well as witness the past, creating ever-widening circles of compassion that would reach toward shores still hidden beyond the horizon's patient curve. Guided by the steady beam of love that once kindled, burns eternal in forms too beautiful and varied to ever fully comprehend. The years moved through the village like gentle tides, each season adding its own subtle texture to the tapestry they had woven from countless threads of memory and care. Ilara's hair had begun to silver at the temples, catching morning light like moonlight on water, and her movements acquired the unhurried grace that comes to those who have learned to trust that every moment holds its own perfect timing. The familiar stirring in her chest had evolved from urgent pull to settled recognition. She was no longer being called toward new discoveries, but becoming the anchor that helped others find their own way to listening. The library had grown beyond its original walls, its influence spreading through the village like roots beneath fertile soil. The listening hour now unfolded naturally, whether Ilara was present or not, guided by Rowan's gentle touch on the back of a chair, and Clara's wordless nods that somehow matched exactly the emotional distance each visitor needed to travel to arrive fully in themselves. People had learned to tend their own stories with the same reverence they brought to tending their gardens, understanding that every heart's journey contributed to the collective wisdom that would nourish future generations. In Lyra's cottage, now transformed into a teaching sanctuary, Ilara shared the gentle arts she had spent decades learning through patient practice. Students arrived not through formal announcement, but drawn by the same mysterious pull that had once guided hearts toward healing, seeking to understand how love persists in objects touched by human hands, how stories accumulate like pearls around moments of genuine recognition. She taught not through lectures but through shared silence, sitting together while awareness settled on surfaces, learning to distinguish between different qualities of emotional echo, practicing the delicate balance between openness and protection that allows deep listening without drowning in others' sorrows. On a morning when spring light filtered through the oak leaves with particular tenderness, Lyra pressed an old wooden shuttle into Ilara's hands. The grain was smooth with decades of patient weaving, and Ilara could feel the impressions of countless hours spent transforming thread into comfort, individual strands into patterns that would warm hearts for generations. "So you know what to do with this," Lyra said, not as instruction but as recognition, and the shuttle's weight settled into Ilara's palm as if it had simply returned home. Within weeks, Lyra's physical presence began to soften at the edges, light shimmering through her like water through reeds, but her spirit remained as constant as the morning mist that still clung to the ancient oak grove. The secret garden had become a pilgrimage site where people planted bulbs in memory of those who had passed, understanding intuitively that love once planted blooms eternal in forms too beautiful to fully comprehend. Under Clara's careful tending, new sections had been added, a meditation circle where the old stone marker reminded visitors that every morning was an invitation to let the world teach them which small act of kindness mattered most. They had built a trellis from the old baker's counter, salvaging wood that still carried the warmth of morning bread, and when the first bean pods formed, someone called them legacy beans, a name that stuck like a familiar nickname the garden had been waiting to receive. Working together by lamplight, Ilara and Rowan began gathering their practices into a small book with soft pages and generous margins, handwritten in the unhurried script that seemed to absorb love along with ink. They called it a tender guide for listening places, though inside it was more lullaby than manual, gentle passages on how to sit with old sorrow, how to arrange a table for the return of long-traveled stories, how to end a night with a quiet light that said to every echo, "Thank you for visiting. You can rest now." Clara added pages of counting patterns and drew small constellations in the margins, dots and lines that resembled the roots of lighthouse beams across remembered water. The community quilt had grown into an expansive testament to shared stories, stretching across 3 tables in the library's reading room, its accumulated squares telling tales of resilience and connection that seemed to shimmer with their own quiet light when afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows. Young couples brought their wedding photographs to be woven into the great tapestry of love that stretched back through generations, while new parents contributed their children's first drawings, understanding that these simple offerings would someday whisper encouragement to future hearts learning to see beauty in the world. When Kyle appeared that spring with dust on, his boots and the linen map folded like a secret the day had earned. New threads revealed themselves in faint glimmers where morning light struck at precise angles, pathways pulsing from distant towns whose names felt too small for what was awakening there. He traced a looping route that began at a coastal village and spiraled inward toward other communities learning to tend their own stories. "Your lighthouse has begun to sing to other shores," he said with a smile toward Clara, who had grown tall and sure in her rhythms, her gift for perceiving heart distances, now helping guide others through their emotional landscapes, with the same gentle precision her father had once brought to guiding ships safely home. Ilara had become, without conscious effort or grand declaration, a living repository of the community's emotional history, a bridge between generations that spanned not just time but the delicate distances between hearts. Children, now grown with children of their own, would bring their little ones to sit beside her, sensing instinctively that her presence offered a kind of grounding that was both ancient and ever new. They didn't always know why they sought her out, only that in her quiet company, their anxieties settled, their questions found unspoken answers, and the world felt for a time a little more whole. Her legacy was written not in monuments or grand speeches, but in the countless whispers of understanding that passed between souls who had learned to recognize their own worthiness through her gentle witness. It lived in the way young mothers learn to trust their instincts after sharing tea with someone who truly saw them, in the quiet confidence of artists who chose to follow their calling after feeling their gifts recognized and affirmed, in the invisible network of communities around the world where people were learning that the most profound healing happens when someone approaches with nothing to fix, only the willingness to witness what asks to be seen. During the Harvest Festival that autumn, as golden light slanted through the square, and 3 generations of children played games passed down through countless seasons, Ilara found herself surrounded by faces she had watched grow from childhood to parenthood, to the silver wisdom of age. In the gentle bustle of neighbors, sharing the fruits of their labor and the stories of their year's journey, she understood that her true gift to the world was not the individual hearts she had helped heal, but the transformation of an entire community into a place where healing happened naturally, where stories found their perfect witnesses, where the gentle hum of forgotten things had become a song everyone knew how to sing. As evening settled over the celebration and lanterns began to glow like earthbound stars, Ilara felt her role shifting one final time, from active teacher to living example of how one heart, learning to listen with sufficient tenderness, could become a tuning fork that helped an entire world remember its own capacity for love. Somewhere beyond the hills, she could sense new places beginning to listen, new hearts preparing to answer the call that had once drawn her from the oak grove toward her first glimpse of how forgotten things learn to sing again when someone finally knows how to hear them. The Harvest Festival's golden light lingered in the village's memory like honey in a jar, and as autumn settled into its deeper rhythms, Ilara felt the familiar stirring in her chest transform once again, not pulling her toward new discoveries, but inviting her into the most profound recognition of all. The seasons were teaching her their final lesson about the gentle art of returning, showing her how every ending blooms into beginning when witnessed with sufficient tenderness and trust. Lyra's presence had become gossamer light, visible mainly in the early hours when mist clung to the cottage windows, and the boundary between memory and moment grew thin as silk. Her physical form shimmered at the edges like morning light through water, but her influence remained constant, woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that people would pause while kneading bread or mending torn seams, suddenly aware of hands guiding their own, of wisdom passing through touch and intention rather than words. The cottage itself had begun to glow around the edges, the way certain afternoons do when light becomes more companion than weather. And Ilara understood that she was witnessing not departure, but transformation. On a morning when the mist lay particularly thick, wrapping the world in a tender embrace, Ilara found Lyra in her favorite rocking chair, a half-finished piece of mending draped across her lap, her eyes closed, a faint smile playing on her lips. The cottage hummed with profound peace, a melody of gratitude and quiet contentment, and when Lyra's breath finally joined the eternal rhythm of wind through oak leaves, there was no sharp grief, only the soft ache of recognition that love, once given, transforms into something that can nourish future hearts across any distance. The village grieved the way they had learned to, openly, gently, with hands occupied by small tasks that turned sorrow into service. Someone placed Lyra's favorite thimble beneath a glass bell in the library, not as relic, but as reminder of what mending looks like when done with love. The community quilt grew a new square stitched from a length of Lyra's unfinished warp. And the visible knot at one corner was left on purpose, a truthful punctuation that honored both completion and continuity. Other gentle farewells followed like leaves releasing themselves to autumn wind. The old schoolteacher, whose art collection had become a treasured part of the library's memory maps, simply stopped appearing at the listening hour, his presence shifting from the chair by the window to the quiet wisdom that now resided in children's laughter, echoing through the library's halls. Mrs. Henley, the baker's widow whose silver grief had softened into gratitude, peacefully joined her husband, and the scent of fresh bread in the morning seemed to carry a deeper, sweeter note of remembrance. Elara found herself walking through the village with expanded awareness, perceiving how familiar places held not just echoes of the past, but gentle traces of those who had moved on. The old stone bridge pulsed with memory of Lyra's unhurried steps, the quiet dignity of the schoolteacher's thoughtful pauses, the resilient hope that had carried Mrs. Henley through her long journey from sorrow to peace. These were not sharp absences but warm presences, love that had learned to express itself in new forms, in the way morning light fell across certain doorsteps, in the particular quality of silence that settled over the square at twilight, in the invisible threads that continued to connect all hearts, touched by genuine care. Clara had grown tall and sure in her rhythms, her gift for perceiving heart distances, now helping guide others through their emotional landscapes, with lighthouse precision. She came with sea wind braided through her hair, preparing to visit her father at the far point, and when Elara tied a slender ribbon around her wrist, woven from Lyra's last skein, Clara traded a piece of pale green sea glass in return. They stood together at the edge of the square, saying nothing that needed saying. Watching children draw circles in chalk that afternoon, rain would soften but never quite erase. In the secret garden, plants that had bloomed for decades gracefully gave way to new growth, their roots nourishing the soil for the next generation of wildflowers and herbs. Working alongside Clara in these gentle transitions, Elara created what they called memory seeds, small bundles that held the essence of particular forms of healing, wrapped in scraps of fabric that still hummed with the love that had once shaped them into comfort. Some bundles held the silver grief that softens into gratitude. Others carried the golden warmth of recognition that helps lost souls remember they belong somewhere. The library continued its quiet work under Rowan's tender guidance, the listening hour unfolding naturally, whether Elara was present or not. People had learned to tend their own stories with the same reverence they brought to tending their gardens, understanding that every heart's journey contributed to the collective wisdom that would nourish future generations. The community quilt stretched across its tables like a slow river made of memories and kindness, each new square adding its voice to the growing testament of how individual lives, when woven together with care, create patterns far greater than the sum of their parts. As winter settled over the village with its familiar hush, Elara began preparing for her own next transformation, not with urgency or fear, but with the same patient attention she had always brought to tending roses or listening to stories held in worn wooden spoons. She spent long evenings by lamplight, understanding that her gift was meant to scatter like dandelion seeds on spring wind, taking root wherever hearts were ready to learn the gentle art of truly listening. The oak grove waited beyond the cottage windows, its ancient branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed countless stories of transformation. When Elara walked those moss-covered paths again, she felt herself becoming part of the story rather than simply its witness, understanding that every gentle returning was a promise that love, once awakened, continues its work in ways too mysterious and beautiful to ever fully comprehend. In the profound quiet of evening, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent witnessing the world's forgotten songs, Clara felt the familiar pull that had once drawn her toward new discoveries, now inviting her toward the deepest recognition of all. The village no longer needed her active guidance. It had become a living organism, capable of its own forms of memory and healing, where the gentle hum of forgotten things had become a song everyone knew how to sing. Standing at her cottage window, watching lamplight glow in familiar windows across the square, Elara understood that her true legacy was not the individual hearts she had helped heal, but the transformation of an entire community into a place where healing happened naturally, where stories found their perfect witnesses, where every silence held the promise of recognition. Somewhere beyond the hills, she could sense new places beginning to listen, new hearts preparing to answer the call that would guide them toward their own discoveries of how forgotten things learn, to sing again when someone finally knows how to hear them. The morning mist rose from the earth like visible prayers, calling to Elara with the same gentle insistence that had once drawn her toward forgotten gardens and stories waiting to be witnessed. The familiar stirring in her chest had evolved beyond all previous understanding, no longer pulling her toward new discoveries, but inviting her into the most profound transformation of all, the gentle dissolution that comes when a gift completes its journey from individual blessing to universal song. She walked the village paths one final time, her silvered hair catching dawnlight like moonlight on water, her movements carrying the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to trust that every moment holds its own perfect timing. The cobblestones knew her footsteps. The windows glowed with the accumulated warmth of countless evenings spent sharing stories, and the very air seemed to breathe with gratitude for the extraordinary privilege of having been truly heard, truly seen, truly loved. The oak grove welcomed her with the same embrace it had offered decades ago when she first unfurled among the moss-covered roots. The ancient trees stood patient as cathedral pillars, their branches reaching toward sky that shimmered with possibilities just beyond the edge of seeing. This was where it had all begun, where a child had awakened not from birth but from the forest's accumulated love, where the first gentle hum had recognized every heart it touched. Settling among the roots where she had first been found, Clara felt her awareness expanding like ripples on still water, encompassing not just her own journey, but the vast network of healing that had spread from this single point of recognition. She could sense Clara at the distant lighthouse, her gift for perceiving heart distances, now guiding ships safely through both physical storms and emotional ones. Rowan moved through the library with the same reverent attention she had taught him, helping visitors discover that every story deserved a perfect witness. The village itself had become a living testament to how individual healing, when witnessed with sufficient tenderness, creates ripples that transform entire communities into sanctuaries where forgotten things remember how to sing. But the network stretched far beyond their small corner of the world. Following the invisible pathways that Kale's linen map had revealed, Elara's consciousness touched other places where similar awakenings were unfolding. Monasteries where compassion had been woven into daily prayers, coastal towns where lighthouse keepers' children were learning to count the rhythms that help lost souls remember they belong somewhere. Countless homes where extraordinary kindness bloomed in the most ordinary circumstances. As the morning mist began to lift, revealing the grove in its full spring glory, Elara understood that she was witnessing the completion of a circle that had been slowly forming through all the seasons of her growth. The transformation happened not with drama or fanfare, but with the same quiet inevitability as morning mist becoming part of the sky. Her physical form began to shimmer at the edges, growing porous like lace held to lamplight, and she felt herself thinning into presence, becoming part of the grove's accumulated memory. She thought of Lyra, whose wisdom had taught her that mending was about helping broken things remember how to be whole, and felt that presence woven into the rhythmic pulse of earth beneath her. She sensed Kale's spirit in the gentle breeze that carried whispers of distant shores, the promise that compassion's journey was endless. Rowan's love lived in the steady hum that now emanated from the village, a song of shared stories that would echo through the library's halls for generations. And Clara's clear gift shone like a lighthouse beam, connecting shores and guiding lost souls home. Elara's own hum, the wordless melody that had been her constant companion, began to blend with the rustling leaves, with the ancient heartbeat of the grove itself. It was no longer her individual song, but a note in the eternal symphony of compassion that flowed through all existence. She became the gentle stirring that calls sensitive souls toward places ready to be healed, the recognition that passes between gifts, learning to harmonize, the invisible thread that connects all sanctuaries where healing happens quietly. The sun rose higher, painting the grove in shades of gold and emerald, and Elara's form seemed to merge with the light and earth, becoming one with the whispers in the wind, the light through the leaves, and the quiet love that holds the world together. In the village, books began to glow with subtle warmth, that helped visitors find exactly the story they needed. The community quilt shimmered with threads of connection that stretched beyond physical, squares to encompass every heart that had ever contributed to its growing tapestry. Children, playing in the square, would pause sometimes, tilting their heads as if listening to a melody just below the threshold of hearing, and they would smile without knowing why, feeling held by something vast and loving that asked nothing except the courage to remain open to wonder. The gentle hum that had first emerged in the oak grove now flowed through everything, morning mist that carried comfort to hearts beginning difficult days, afternoon light that reminded tired workers that beauty persists, evening quiet that helped families remember what they treasured about belonging to each other. And somewhere, in every place where someone sat quietly with old sorrow until it softened into gratitude, where small acts of kindness created ripples that touched shores they would never see, where forgotten things were finally heard and honored, Ilara's presence continued its work, not as individual healer, but as part of the eternal song that helps the world remember its own capacity for love, its own ability to transform every ending into a beginning when witnessed with sufficient grace. And somewhere, she's still out there, humming softly in the morning mist, part of every gentle whisper that helps a heart remember it is loved. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.